Today, we're jumping into a critical breakdown of the fictional show Starfleet Academy. We're going to distill the core arguments from a couple of really in-depth YouTube reviews that dig into the show's storytelling, its characters, and what the reviewer feels is a pretty flawed writing philosophy at its core. And that quote right there, it really just sums up the whole argument. This central idea is this profound sense of disappointment, that after a full 9 hours of television, the show just fails on some of the most basic levels of storytelling. So let's unpack exactly what that means.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll dive into the specific frustrations with the season finale. Then, we'll pull back a bit to look at the bigger picture, the critique of its characters, who the reviewer says never really change. And finally, we'll get into the why, the writing philosophy that's supposedly behind all these issues. Okay, so the season finale. This is where the critique really sharpens its knives. The argument here is that this one episode is a perfect microcosm of all the show's biggest problems, especially when it comes to setting up huge stakes and then finding a believable way to resolve them. And the first point of contention is just the sheer scale of the threat. You've got a villain whose grand plan threatens 120 billion lives across the entire Federation. The reviewer basically says this number is so massive, so over the top for a show about cadets, that it creates stakes that are almost impossible to wrap up in a satisfying way. So how do you resolve a threat to 120 billion people? Well, this is where the review introduces this idea of space magic. It's their term for these super convenient, often illogical plot devices that seem to bend the rules of the universe just to get our heroes out of a jam. So let's look at some of the actual examples from the finale that the reviewer points to as prime examples of this kind of illogical, convenience-first writing. A big one is what the reviewer calls the hologram ruse. You get this huge dramatic moment where the main ship is totally destroyed, only, nope, turns out it was just a hologram. The problem, according to the critique, is that this completely defies the show's own established tech. These advanced enemy ships should have seen right through a trick like that. And then there's the Doctor's sudden solution. Look, this omega molecule thing has been this unsolvable, apocalyptic problem for 1,000 years. But then the secret to stabilizing it just conveniently pops out of the Doctor's damaged program? The reviewer argues that this is just a wild coincidence that feels totally unearned and makes the 1,000-year problem feel kind of cheap. And to top it all off, you get what the reviewer calls empathic space magic. A character's feelings literally become a physical plot device, acting like a super scanner that can find one person anywhere in the galaxy. It solves a massive logistical problem in a way that, let's be honest, feels a lot more like magic than science fiction.
Now, all these critiques about the plot, they really lead to the reviewer's main overarching point about the show as a whole. And it's all about the characters, specifically the profound lack of any meaningful development for the main cast.
I mean, it doesn't get much more blunt than that, right? The argument is that after 9 hours of TV, these cadets have gone through a lot of stuff, but they haven't actually changed or learned or matured because of it. They're essentially stuck in stasis. And this table really lays it all out. The argument is that for each of these main characters, their defining traits and their core motivations are pretty much identical at the end of the season to where they were at the start. Their individual plot lines just seem to reinforce who they already were instead of actually challenging them to become someone new. The main character, Caleb, is held up as the prime example of this stagnation. His whole reason for being there is to find his mom, which is set up in episode 1. But then, according to the critique, that motivation just goes dormant for most of the season. And in the end, it's not solved through some epic journey, but by him remembering his email password. And this critique of stagnant characters, it spreads across the whole cast. The review claims other cadets have these really one-note motivations. And even the senior staff members either stay exactly the same for 1,000 years, or in some cases, they actually seem to regress as characters. So the really big question is, why? What's the root cause of all these problems? Well, the reviewer doesn't just critique the final product, they try to diagnose the cause. And they point to a very specific writing philosophy they think is at the heart of the show's design. The reviewer actually coins a term for this: selfish emotional beats. The idea is that the story isn't built around a chain of logical events. Instead, it's just a series of disconnected moments, each one designed to showcase how a character is feeling, often at the total expense of plot coherence or any real character growth. And this creates a huge contrast with what you might call classic storytelling, where conflict is supposed to challenge a character and force them to change.
The reviewer argues this show does the complete opposite. It bends the plot and twists logic just to validate how a character already feels, making sure they never actually have to grow or adapt. And they bring receipts, providing specific examples to back this theory up. You have a character who preaches certain values while their actions do the exact opposite. You have a group that responds to a tragic death by immediately making it about their own relationship drama. And you have a character who sees a life-or-death crisis not as a duty, but as, in their viewers' words, pure narcissism. So the big takeaway here is the reviewer's final verdict. This intense focus on validating emotion instead of challenging characters just makes the whole narrative feel hollow. The story ends up feeling less like a cohesive journey and more like a collection of emotional snapshots, which in the end just makes it hard for an audience to connect. And all of this really leaves us with a much broader question, doesn't it? When you're watching a show or a movie, what is that one key ingredient for you? That moment of change, that difficult lesson learned, that makes a character's journey feel truly earned and powerful?